All right, let me...
Good morning!
Hey, buenos dias! It's the morning.
Pareto Distribution? Pareto Distribution?
Pareto Distribution.
Rather?
The distribution de Pareto. Pareto was an Italian guy, statistician dude, who came up with a mathematical notion that there's this distribution that is seen in the world in many different contexts. Thank you. Has a similar shape, and it's like the normal distribution. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the normal distribution. Are you familiar with normal distribution?
No.
Okay. Normal distribution is like when you have something like height. So like if you lined up all the people in Chico.
Most of the people are in the
middle.
Bell hump.
Exactly, the bell curve. That's what the normal distribution is.
Okay. It's
the bell curve, right? So the Pareto distribution is an asymmetrical distribution where the vast majority of whatever it is you're measuring, is grouped up at one end, and then there's this long tail on the other end that has a lot less than the side that has most of the stuff. So you can, and mathematically, it's formalized by the idea that the square root of the population size contains half of whatever it is you're measuring. So not everything is distributed like a Pareto distribution, but some things are.
But money is.
Money is, exactly.
Like a small amount of people have the majority of the wealth.
It's interesting. I don't know if you read about this or you knew it, but that is an observation that is most relevant to the context that I was listening to this whole discussion about this in. And it's a way of like looking at wealth inequality. It's a way that it's used to derive the so-called Gini coefficient, which is like a measure of wealth inequality. There's different parameters to this Pareto distribution, and some are skinnier and some are flatter. But on average, a Pareto distribution, half of the wealth is owned by the square root of the population size. So if you had a group of 100 people who are all part of like a little microeconomy, you would expect, if that economy, which most economies do, behaved according to a Pareto distribution, you would expect that the square root of the number of people, so 10. The square root of 100 is 10, right? So 10 people would own 50% of the wealth. And then, going further up the thing, of that top 10 people, I don't know what the square root of 10 is, it's like 3 point something. So like, let's say about 3 of the people would own half of the wealth owned by the top 10. Uh-huh. So this pattern is not just in economics, it is in a lot of things. Generally, whenever you have a kind of situation where having more of something helps you get more of that thing, you end up with a Pareto distribution.
Yeah.
Whereas in a normal distribution reflects negative feedback. So a Pareto distribution is like you make money, which then helps you make more money. Mm-hmm. So economies tend to go into Pareto distributions. Whereas something like height in a human population is not a Pareto distribution, because being tall doesn't help you get more tall. In fact, there is a kind of trade-off to being tall, because if you're too tall, then you die of a stroke because your blood pressure is too high. Mm-hmm. And that's what sets the upper limit on human height. So when you have two countervailing tendencies, you end up with normal distributions, where when you have self-reinforcing tendencies, you end up with Pareto distributions. And that I found was really interesting, because I never really heard about the Pareto distribution. A lot of, normal distributions are everywhere, but the context that I was listening to some Jordan Peterson episode about this. He was talking about Pareto distributions in terms of wealth inequality and how that works. And he didn't mention this, but the observation, something occurred to me that of how this relates to decentralization, that so if you go with this square root idea, where let's say if your goal is to reduce income inequality, you could create a bureaucracy that could attempt to do that, right? You could create a bureaucracy that's like, well, this is unequal. We're going to take from the top and we're going to give to the bottom. Great. That never went wrong before, right?
Works every time.
Works every time. So many great examples of that working. Okay, so, whatever. My point is not to criticize that. My point is to say that there is another alternative if you think about the parameters of the Pareto distribution. This is where I'm veering off into my thoughts about this, is that notice if you shrink the population size, that is a way of giving the median person more money. So, like for instance, if you have a group of 100 people, you have 10 people who are having half the wealth. Uh-huh. If you have a group, though, of let's say, I don't know, what's a good number here? 1 million people. The square root of 1 million is 1,000. Mm-hmm. You have 1,000 people having half the wealth. Mm-hmm. So 1,000 is 1/1000th of 1 million. A 10 is only 1/10 of 100. Literally the definition of a square root. So, but my point is that, so as you increase the population size, the fraction of the wealth, basically Pareto distributions become steeper as a function of the population size.
You're right. Yeah.
So my point is that if you wanted to create more opportunity for people and more like genuine participation in an economy, if you were able to shrink the context in which Pareto distributions formed, you might actually get somewhere. And you can see the inverse of this, which is what's called the internet. In prior times, when you had a bunch of distributed villages that did not talk to each other, there was a blacksmith, and hey, I'm the town blacksmith. I'm the only blacksmith? Well, no, there's 2 blacksmiths, and we mainly just have all the business in the town because we're the only blacksmiths. Okay, so you have a somewhat flatter Pareto distribution because the context is geographically limited. But now we have Amazon. So if you're going to compete, you're going to compete against 1 million other people. So now there's going to be huge winners and a bunch of losers. Yeah. I think, so my 2 premises in here is that Pareto distributions are so much more inevitable than bureaucracy will ever be able to handle. Yeah. That's premise 1. And then premise 2 is that I suppose there is some value in increasing the share of people who can productively get wealth, but maybe a smarter, therefore, maybe a smarter version of approaching wealth inequality is to sort of fuck with the parameters of where Pareto distributions form. And when I start thinking about this, it starts getting suspiciously close to the idea of community formation. Because creating communities, economic context that can't be subsumed into larger contexts as a way to create opportunity for people.
I mean, you'd have to have so many self-sustaining technologies, modular self-sustaining technologies like earth ships in New Mexico. Like, communities would have to be way more self-sustaining than they are now.
Yeah. They would be.
Psychologically, it's that zooming in on a smaller set of parameters that's required to be functional in your community already. It doesn't really do to start out your practical step-by-step career of how to build your fortune or your startup thinking you're going to beat Bezos next year. Like, you're putting yourself in the wrong, ladder set, and the Pareto distribution is one predictor of your failure. So you draw out a sandbox of a much smaller thing and gain value along what your career goal is in that smaller parameter, and then that success will bring more success, and then pretty soon you'll be at the top of your community.
Yeah.
And then Pareto distribution will add to that, and the community that you're able to give and extract value back and forth with will grow to master that smaller community. So what I feel like you were saying was decentralization, just like setting the rules of the game in smaller sandboxes than the entire fucking world.
Yeah. It's a way to create a balancing tendency. Like it's a way to rebalance the economy against the globalizing effects of the internet, because I don't think that the globalizing effects of the internet are going to go away, and I don't think that they should go away.
Well, in the right mixture of elements, that globalization is the only way these cellular communities are going to be able to be self-sustaining.
Sure. Yes. Because they have to be able to negotiate trade with each other and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yes. No, so I think even, like, I think that it is inevitable that there is going to be a global domain, even more so in the future. Like, I don't think that it's a good idea to try to somehow, like, limit the global trade or flow of goods or ideas at all, because ultimately there is something extremely efficient about having a massive population in which people can compete, because even though it creates extreme inequality, it also it creates extreme productivity. And it's good to have something in the world like Amazon, but I think it's bad to only have something like Amazon in the world.
Yeah.
And that, like, so I'm imagining the pioneering of these smaller contexts in which there'd be a more favorable Pareto distribution for the average person being pioneered in somewhat of a orthogonal context to a global market, like something that for a more fundamental reason a global market can't serve. And the example that comes to mind is, for instance, like your t-shirt business. You're hawking these hoodies, these t-shirts. You know, if you just were like, well, I'm making t-shirts, and that was your entire statement, you're okay. Well, now congratulations, you're competing against 10 million other t-shirt producers.
Yes.
What are the chances that you're going to land on the good side of the Pareto distribution against 10 million people? Not a lot.
Yeah.
It's possible, but not a lot. So I'm getting into more like this question of what does it mean to create, to start in a smaller context? Like, what concretely does staking out a context or, you know, drawing a little box in the sand look like? You know, Chico is a pretty good proxy for that.
I agree.
Because there's something fun, there's some character about Chico that makes it to where in Chico, local art is valued more than anonymous, not Chico art. So that bias right there naturally creates a almost like protective shield in which smaller, nascent, independent distributions can exist.
Yeah.
Right. So what is that magical ability that Chico has to do that? Well, character, community, what is that? See? So there's like some economic power to this specialness.
Well, there's a lot of, that specialness translates to economic power.
Yes.
In potential, very little leveraged so far. I think part of it is the individuality of it. It was made by a John and Annie Bidwell. Like there's a like person responsible for the town. Like
instead of
like who built Vacaville? Like,
You know what's funny?
who's the godfather of Fairfield?
I-80 is the guy father. That's what it is.
Yeah, no one and everyone / no one. That's one aspect of what.
You know what's funny? I talked to someone from Vacaville, who was from Vacaville a few days ago. Mm-hmm. And I kept my thoughts about Vacaville. See, I didn't be like, you're from Vacaville. Oh my God, what the fuck? You're from Vacaville. Well, I did find an interesting fact, though, in the course of my conversation with this Vacaville native, that actually...
Vacavillager?
So, a cow. No, that actually is, what I found out is that actually it's not named after a cow. It was named after, like, some, I'm going to butcher this, but, like, some Ferdinand de Vaca or something. Like, some Spanish guy whose last name was Vaca, which may or may not be related to a cow in his ancestry, probably was. So, ultimately, indirectly, it's named after a cow. But it was not just, like, some people were like, hey, senor, what is this town called? There's a lot of cows. Okay, it's Vacaville. You know.
Cow.
Yeah, like, a lot of cows here, you know. No, it wasn't that. That was kind of, I guess, what I thought.
So it was named after a person.
It was named after a person.
Nice.
It was that this dude was probably like, I don't know, the padre of whatever was there, and then now is Vacaville. But, yeah, so interesting tidbit.
So Pareto Distribution, where I've noticed it in my own experience, is with original creation and original creativity. And being able to create things from nothing that are firmly from me and not derivative. I started out not being able to do that. And the process by which I was able to achieve any measure of that was sporadic and accidental and dependent on so many ephemeral factors that I couldn't quite count on to be there next time. And now there's this momentum going where I can barely keep up with everything I'm trying to create. And some of it's referential, so that's less original, like talking about a current events thing or analyzing a movie with Jade, you know, that's less original. That's less creative, but it's on a momentum now, and it's just going. And a year from now, I'm going to be going even more. And I was, like, seeing... I was about to text my friend who's my age and started arting a bit before me to ask him, like, are you starting to feel this 33 years old thing, like where you can dependably create something original and like feel it coming and time when it's coming and like say a thing is going to be done pretty soon and then it is done? And then I didn't text him because like I knew the answer would be no. But
funny.
But that's the feeling I was getting, was like, holy shit, like, I was able to, like, read the weather with such accuracy and dependability that, like, I could make a song with Liam, and we just decided it would be done in November, and decided we would put 2 days into it together, and it just blossomed, and it just happened. And now I'm, like, already projecting forward into a calendar of like, okay, I'm not ready to make another like thing with Liam yet. That like well is dry, but while that well fills back up, I'm gonna go like tend to this other well of songwriting that I have over here that I can feel is full.
This is like Age of Empires.
And I'm looking around myself, and there's not much creativity of this pure from nothing to something sense around me. And why there isn't is because it's really fucking hard. And why I am able to is because it's been my mission statement to be able to do that for fucking 10 years straight. I've been hammering at this fucking mountain. I'm just starting to get there, but it's like I can see it swirling around
I feel like there's interesting you say like you don't see a lot of this around you. I think there's a even deeper reason for that.
Of course there
than
is.
the fact that it's hard. I think that perhaps you could say that now the ability to create a facsimile of something worthwhile is easier, or it's easier to create like referential material.
I think that's always been the case.
Well, I think it's more the case now. There's more opportunity for referential material. Like, and one example of this is that I was looking at our podcast this morning, and I saw that by far the most views that anything has gotten is Ghost in the Shell.
Yeah.
And why is that? Well, you know why? Because there's people on fucking YouTube searching for Ghost in the Shell shit, and they click on this and they go, maybe they enjoyed it. I hope that they did. But
what's ironic about that episode is
it's really not about that very much.
not about
I know.
Ghost in the Shell.
Downvote, dislike, yeah. No.
Like 20 minutes out of like 80 or 90 minutes.
But that actually proves by what I'm saying is that we just accidentally made clickbait.
Right.
And if we are accidentally benefiting from clickbait, just think how much you could benefit as if we went full clickbait, and that's why everything is clickbait.
And that's this rush to this lowest common denominator.
Because clickbait works, baby. It works so well, and no one has figured out how to not get sucked in by clickbait. Even I get clickbaited. I clickbait myself all the time.
Joe Rogan, he doesn't clickbait. He just puts in work.
But people, he doesn't, but people create a credible amount of derivative clickbait based on his clips, his takes,
well,
positive, negative.
That's not Joe Rogan doing that.
No, it's not him.
The lion's share of the wealth goes to the guy who's responsible for it.
Yeah, he's created a whole ecosystem of like little like parasite
and
fungi.
And yes, there's leeches using it to make clickbait, sure.
Yeah, there's a whole ecology of people who are slowly decomposing the raw material that he pioneered or whatever. But I guess I don't know if clickbait is related to the character of someone's work. It's more the way it's presented.
But you started out talking about thinking there's a deeper reason why you don't see a lot of the pure creativity.
Well, yeah, I mean because it's easier to use. Or I'd say original work has to compete against more unoriginal work because there's just simply more work going on. But in the true spirit of the Pareto Distribution, most of that work is not great.
I think it's like...
So the pool of work has been expanded.
I think it's like with the unoriginal work, you're standing on the shoulders of people who did the real work of creating something original. The real work of creating something original, I think there's something like that 10,000 hours rule operating there. And there's no way around it. You don't break through into the market with your own novel innovation that's original without that 10,000 hours or whatever its equivalent is in your own karma. So it's not, in that sense, it's not surprising to me that my first album doesn't get like huge accolades because I'm not standing on the shoulders of a successful genre or getting more successful artists to feature on my tracks. Right. I'm just starting from nothing, and it's gonna take that album's beauty is going to take a few other albums set next to it to build a momentum unique unto themselves, to just be a solid enough object that people start noticing the whitewater breaking around it and wondering what that new thing is there.
It's not standing on the shoulders, nor is it hanging on the coattails.
And so if you're not going to do that, then what you have to do instead is put in the 10,000 hours.
Right. Sometimes I think about, what if it was like 1965? let's get the band together. We're gonna make a record. Okay. How many records are there? How many like new like psychedelic rock records are dropping in California in a given year in 1965? I don't know. Honestly, I don't know.
Probably a shit ton.
Okay. Less or more albums that are coming out now? Probably less, right?
Ooh.
Even accounting for population size. I would say that a greater proportion of the population is
You're
making
saying
music.
less.
I'm thinking that in the past there was less new music per person. I was tempted to say capita, but let's say person.
I'm being contrarian, and I'll just drop that and let you probably be right. Less albums were being made back then. Probably.
You think so?
I don't really think so, but
Well,
I suspect a mountain of bullshit was getting made just now.
And then there's like a selection, survivor bias where we only see the good stuff.
Mm-hmm. Just think of going into a record store or a record resale and the mountains of vinyl of bands you've never heard of.
I'm willing to grant that it is, of course, it's undeniable that there is a survivor bias at play. Of course there is. But I also think that there's probably, just due to the fact that there are simply lower barriers of entry to the art distribution game now than there were than ever before.
I think I'm being contrarian
distribution.
Again. The distribution is opened up now.
Yes.
We can all produce our records. We don't have to physically print them anymore, so that's even less of a gateway. But there's what do you call it? A barrier to entry. I think there's the barriers of entry are still very much in play and just taking different forms and are psychological primarily in the form of nihilism and ideology. There are huge barriers to entry to creating anything.
Interesting. Yeah, because I guess you could think of it like, so the Pareto distribution maintains its shape. If anything, it becomes steeper as the barriers to entry to distribution drop. So what that logically implies...
More players in the game steepens the...
Yes. But the fact that it is still a Pareto distribution, and it is perhaps, as I'm postulating, that you're, maybe being contrarian about, but I don't know, it doesn't really matter. The fact that it is still maintaining the shape of a Pareto distribution, even though the barriers of entry to production and distribution have dropped, implies that, I guess this is to your point, that there are other barriers taking up the slack to maintain that distribution. Okay. And you're saying that that is ideology and nihilism. That's a pretty reasonable hypothesis. Because what else stops people? Because the average quality of stuff hasn't gone up by orders of magnitude. Why are we still listening to this amazing music that was made super long ago?
Oh, this plays into my essay.
Really? Okay. Well, maybe you
were you in the middle of?
No, I guess I'm just tying this together with what you're saying about how if nihilism or ideology is a sort of new fangled barrier to entry. I'm thinking maybe that in some sense that's quite clear that there's something is picking up the slack and preventing. As the barriers to, anyone can make an album now, anyone can make a YouTube channel, anyone can...
So why are so few of them of any remarkable
What is
note?
the new thing that is preventing success?
Yeah.
Right, because it clearly isn't the ability to print a vinyl record anymore. It isn't the ability to get capital to start, because you don't need any capital to start now. Yeah. It's the ability to, I guess... We're translating that currency into personal something, yeah.
It's the ability to make good art with the lemons we're being handed. We've been handed such a insane tableau of circumstance that people don't yet know how to integrate the disparate pieces in a new and useful way and portray that integration with art.
So
the sense making, there's no sense or art isn't being used and wielded and leveraged as the integrating, sense-making, new value-creating tool that it's meant to be.
So do you think that the culture 50 years ago was more easily digestible and transmutable?
We had, this is where my essay comes in, we had a shared objectivity to refer to in the form of World War II. And every part of our story, like Vietnam War included, was a direct, linear Cliff's Notes of, well, first World War II happened, and then here, and then here, and then here, and then that's why this is happening. So we had clear sense-making available, or we had a clear narrative shared between everybody. But I'm gonna smoke now.
Which created a kind of stability in the it created a set of shared assumptions on which a lot of complexity could be premised.
The objects in our psychological bedroom were very clear objects, and there was a handleable amount of them. Life was simpler back then.
Dude, now we're in a Gen Z bedroom. There's fucking clothes all over the floor. There's Uber Eats boxes everywhere.
There's augmented reality gemstones just rotating in the space that you have to have your Oculus on to see.
Yeah, there's like 4 internet connected devices. Half of them are playing porn. One of them is trading crypto, and the other one is like on like a virtual therapy visit with your. Just kidding, man. I don't know anything about Gen Z. This is like my character.
No, they're on their Zoom class at their junior high.
Yeah, that's what it is. That's what it is. They're staring into a laptop that they can't look their eyes away from because then it would detect cheating, while they do their multiple choice high school work.
That is one of the most dystopian things
I'm not even fucking exaggerating. I was reading about this on Hacker News, where people were like, justifiably lamenting this turn of events. That's what's happened now, is that there's a kind of like this surveillance industrial complex or whatever has turned its eye of Sauron towards like pre-college education now.
And then they have to compensate. Well, it's just the way in which bad ideas necessitate even worse ideas. Like detecting eyes looking away from the screen to hedge against cheating is this overcorrection you have to make for the initial terrible idea of having classes on Zoom.
It's such a ridiculous idea that somehow we're all obliged to pretend that, like, yes, this is a reasonable substitute. Let's just forge ahead with this idea. Like, it's not possible that it could be like, well, look, people's grades are plummeting, their mental health is plummeting, their test scores are plummeting. At what point do you just hypothetically draw a line that goes like, okay, if the outcomes go below this point, we have to fundamentally change course?
You don't register. There's a problem in the myth of what it is to be human there. You don't register an error there if you portray the world as a veil of tears. I'm getting a little like too deep and too mythical there. But people's worldview is basically, if it's not nihilistic as an escape from religion, it's religious original sin-based, which comes out to the same thing. So like huge mistakes and huge inefficiencies don't even register an error in your worldview, because you just go, that's life. Sometimes bad things happen and we're forced to all go to Zoom meetings together. And it doesn't even, without a beatific image of what life could and should be running in your imagination and in your ideals, you don't even take issue with nationwide lockdowns, for example.
Ooh, you know what? That is a very interesting segue into my prompt about the necessity for the existence of a transcendental idea outside of the political context.
Yeah, we can go there.
I gotta go take a piss real quick in the bushes.
I'll sideboard my World War II essay and we'll go there. And it'll.
Okay, well, circle back. All
I'm
right.
sure it'll
Okay.
feedback
All right.
automatically.
Beautiful.
The need for a transcendent ideal that lies outside of politics.
Yes.
For purposes of what? Being healthy? Or like for a civilization to thrive?
The latter. I think that there's something about, like, maybe it sort of relates to this idea you were talking about how, like, in the 60s cultural blossoming, there was kind of shared consciousness of, like, post-World War II. That's what, when you brought that up, that's what reminded me of this, something that was from this podcast about it was Jordan Peterson talking to this Islamic scholar guy, and they were kind of talking about how, they were talking about, like, whether or not religion necessarily contains this latent totalitarian impulse, because apparently, like, people of the Sam Harris-esque view, I think, are of the view that religion, being fundamentally non-rational, contains the latent totalitarian impulse, because, and that's what you would think if you think that reason is the fundamental bastion of stability. And my immediate impulse was, in prior modes of my life, I was absolutely of the belief that reason was was the best fundamental basic foundation that would, like, create stability and peace, but I don't really think that anymore. I look at reason as being kind of like a
I think it is. I think it's the surface visible part of that bastion. The way that bastion of stability for a civilization shows itself in the human landscape is the rational mind. But it's something deeper and more far-reaching than that makes reason as one of its results.
Okay, so indulging irrationality is obviously potentially destructive.
I think it's consistently destructive. I'm interrupting you.
It's cool. This is going to take a second to tease out. So, reason is ultimately okay. Put it this way: reason is only as good as the axioms you start with.
Yeah.
So, if you start with, for example, the axiom that people are inherently bad, then you can create an entirely consistent logical system that will create a set of consequences that follow beautifully from that starting premise.
But end in something like Holocaust.
Exactly. And the point that Jordan Peterson and this Islamic scholar dude was talking about, I wish I remembered his name because he was a pretty smart guy, seemingly, what they were getting at was that in the 20th century, there was at least a couple examples, Stalinism and Nazism, that were, that were quite atheistic and materialist and not at all rooted in any sort of metaphysical religious tradition, but nonetheless expressed all of the worst parts of human nature and had the exact same consequences of a terrible religious war that had, wars that had been fought, atrocities.
You just saw the same traits of the Spanish Inquisition.
Right.
Just scaled up.
Yeah, instead of heretics, it was, being burnt at the stake. It was communists or fascists or capitalists or whatever. So I think that speaks to the necessity of taking a look at what are the axioms. Like, I think it makes more sense to think of the axioms that you're using as kind of like the seed that contains the destiny of what happens when you apply reason to them. Because reason is something that has a way of complexifying itself, where you start with a premise and you reach another conclusion, then you use that to build on to more, and you build on to more. So my original thing is that I came to this idea of like, something that they said was the necessity of having a transcendent ideal outside of politics. And religion, the mystical roots of religion in most religions, Islam, according to this guy, Christianity, according to Jordan Peterson, and a lot of other things that we wouldn't necessarily recognize as religion, but is religion, they start with a mystical insight that, because of its mystical, ineffable nature, is necessarily apolitical. And over time, what happens, this is my thoughts, over time, what happens is that this mystical core becomes appropriated by a whatever political like structure is going on in the environment at the time. So like mystical Christianity, Gnosticism, Christianity was derived from a lot of mystical Greek traditions fused with whatever was going on in the ancient Judaic world, and
it's the Greek shit and the Jewish shit and a guy named Jesus Christ.
Yeah, and that created a kind of social power.
And then Roman imperialism.
Exactly. And then the moment in which it became welded to the state, it became a state religion, and it became
in the form of Roman.
Yes.
Okay.
And the power of mystical Christianity was subsumed into the Roman state, and the rest is history. So something similar, this Islamic scholar was saying, happened with Muhammad, that it was the same kind of thing, where Muhammad was a prophet who was preaching monotheism, and then that, they were persecuted, he fled to another city, and then he raised an army to fight, and then the rest is history. Okay. So the same kind of thing happened to Islam as the same thing happened to Christianity, where you had this kind of mystical thing that got politicized.
Okay.
And I was thinking about, I was like, that's really, like, God damn it, that's just par for the course. Everything powerful becomes politicized if it doesn't grow faster than politics can.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of like, I guess, to try to translate this to practical terms, I think that there's almost like a race against time, that if you create something valuable, it has to grow faster than it can be parasitized. So, because if you take something powerful and you just leave it on the table and you let it stagnate, it's going to become an instrument of politics. So, like something like I don't know. Let's see, like psychedelics, for example, is a modern example of a mystical object. Like, for example, the tripping on mushrooms experience is somewhat apolitical nowadays.
Yeah.
40 years ago, it was extremely politicized, but it got clamped down on so hard that it went underground, which, in a way, took it off the radar of the political establishment, and everyone just kind of forgot about it. And now there's a new little nascent, like, hey guys, this is still a thing, rediscovery. But I think that if we wait like another 10 years before doing anything with it, it's just going to become politicized again. And there's going to be a new polarization, and there's going to be a new appropriation of that mystical power in order to fuel some ultimately materialist political enterprise. Because it happened with everything. It's happening with the internet right now. The internet is a perfect example of this. In the late 90s, the internet was this incredibly utopian, expanding, blossoming, anarchic riot of human diversity.
Yeah.
And but the fact that it became Facebookified, the fact that social networks locked it down and made it into like a TV/shopping mall experience, kind of blunted the growth rate of it and allowed it to become this tool of surveillance now. So the idea, I think, in order to keep things, my idea is that in order to keep things healthy, they have to grow fast. They have to grow faster than the ecological parasites in the environment can start latching onto them.
If it's a transcendent ideal being crystallized here, then one of the traits of a transcendent ideal is it can exist as a seed for centuries and be sovereign and stable and just as powerful a century from now as it was a century ago. It can wait, it can bide its time if it's actually transcendent.
Sure. But what happens in the meantime is that it gets coated and it gets wrapped in layers and layers and layers of politics, to where it's like the...
But it's basically independent of those things, and it'll just crop up somewhere completely unexpected later.
Yeah, but it'll probably be after our lifetimes. I mean, I'm not willing to wait that long. I'm thinking, like, the image I have in my mind is like the tabernacle, God, that's like in a curtain. There's a curtain, there's like an inner sanctum, and then there's an outer sanctum, and then there's this little mystical core that is, fucking leaf blower, Jesus. He snuck. Pack it up, boys.
He snuck right next to us.
and then like...
letting loose.
Hope you guys weren't using this park. Oh my God.
What you have also functioning here is a default of the myth of the masculine myth. Well, with a strong, healthy myth of the divine masculine, it would be socially unacceptable as a man, to be doing a bullshit job. Or you, personally, you'd have personal moral qualms about showing up to a job that was less than heroic in your own conception. But as a society, we don't paint men as especially heroic. And so the men of our blue-collar workers, a healthy chunk of them are just given...
Pointless physical labor.
Yeah, and they accept it. That's the problem that I'm pointing out. They accept it.
That's what they do in the old school prison, is like hard labor, breaking big rocks into little rocks. It's like literally, doing pointless work as like a form of punishment. So it's definitely not good for you. Yeah, it is weird how people accept doing pointless jobs that are objectively pointless, like leaf blowing wet leaves. I think it's definitely speaks to sort of like a giving up on the idea that maybe work is good or something like that, or that people have something to contribute, instead of just doing I guess we just have to kind of like play this little game to like get the handout at the end of the day. You look at the economy as just like a thing to get something instead of something you're contributing to.
Yeah, if you have a worldview of work is good, I have something uniquely individual to contribute, and I work to bring that unique contribution of my own individuality into the culture, and then I'm paid in kind for it. With a set of values declared for yourself personally like that, you just wouldn't be okay with a bullshit job. Okay, we had an entire essay while we were listening to Leaf Blowers. We had an entire essay about how pointless bullshit jobs like leaf blowing, so that you can provide proof of work at the end of the day, so you can get your paycheck from the city bureaucracy, is like the Bitcoin proof of work. And if we can abstract away that work so you can just have proof of stake instead, like Vitalik Buterin is developing, then you can just like sign your signature under like complying to a certain set of like, you didn't cheat and you did things correctly. So you don't have to like burn the fuel to blow the leaves. You can just sign the document. And there's something about, that's the better half of Andrew Yang's UBI thing, was noting that all of us are passively creating value, and Facebook is just grabbing all of it. But if we can better articulate how each individual is creating passive value just by surfing the internet, then we can distribute that money that they're actually making back to themselves.
Yes.
And then in that way, UBI isn't just taking out of Jeff Bezos's checking account at a regular basis and paying people. It's like just properly getting the money that you are making by existing into your wallet.
I think that in the spirit of this, what we were talking about with the sort of analogy between proof of work and bullshit jobs, I guess I'll have to just summarize that for a second.
Damn it, I tried to summarize.
No, you did a really good job summarizing it, honestly. You probably did it a lot more succinctly than I did. But I just want to point out one feature in particular that I think leads into the next thing, is that when you have a proof of work system, the reason why it's still valuable, even though, like the reason it's still valuable for Bitcoin nodes to burn a bunch of energy solving hash functions to validate transactions on the network, is because consensus itself is valuable enough in comparison to total chaos that it is worth doing a bunch of pointless, seemingly pointless work to get consensus. Like you have to pay for consensus.
And then once you figure out that it's consensus being made that is making the value, then you can just skip past all the leaf blowing and just work on how to make the consensus.
Yes, there is because fundamentally on the on a basic level, there's two fundamental sources of consensus. One of them is a hierarchy, and the other is a distributed network like Bitcoin, or an ecology, which is an ecology, where so you either have one central locus of control where ultimately everyone is answerable to the king or God or whatever like that. You have that kind of like central...
everyone's looking at the same thing, and that's consensus.
You have a central coordinating node that is sponsoring what's real. That's one mode of consensus. But the drawback to that mode of consensus is that it is extremely fragile, because if anything that happens to that central node, well, everyone's fucked. Or, which is why this succession of kings is so important and so critical. And also, the problem with that hierarchy is that it also lacks information processing capability, because people who have the ability to make decisions are alienated from the lower levels where the actual activity is occurring, and so they have less information per decision they have to make, and so they make shitty decisions.
It's obviously unstable, and so the other part of making consensus is an ecology. It's ecology.
Where you have competition over some scarce resource. So in biology, that's energy. In democracy, that's votes. Or in an economy, that's money. Or in terms of Bitcoin's consensus forming ability, it's the ability to find arbitrary hash functions, solutions to hash functions, which is proportional to the amount of energy that you burn, energy is proportional to the amount of money you burn. So the idea is that if you were to translate this proof of work into pointless jobs that people do, you can understand blowing leaves as a kind of pointless work that is nonetheless being done to maintain the consensus of everyone getting a paycheck. So Andrew Yang's UBI idea, which you pointed out, I think would be really great. However, what is needed before UBI could work is a healthy form of capitalism. And I think that what needs to be done first is that before we just give a paycheck to literally everyone, there has to be some kind of healthier mechanisms in place. Otherwise, all that money is immediately going to get sucked to the top of the pyramid.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, look what's happening right now with the inflation. When you have all these stimulus checks, what's going up? Crypto's going up, stocks are going up, real estate is going up. Every kind of asset is becoming massively inflated, and it's creating a situation where like no one can afford a house unless you're a hedge fund. So, and that's why all of the hedge funds, you know, like private residences are being bought up by sort of like, you know, capital, not private owners, but they're being bought up by huge companies and then rented back to people. That is a massive net loss for society because now you have centralization of ownership, which has political implications. So I think that Andrew Yang's idea of UBI needs to be put in place, if that's going to happen, it needs to be put in place after we've kind of like shorn up the ability for independent free markets to exist without being controlled by, and, you know, without basically just monopolies being created by the bureaucracies that we have in place. Because right now, the bureaucracies we have in place to manage capitalism are the primary reason why capitalism doesn't function and doesn't provide equality for people as much as it could.
Just managing capitalism is a fucking contradiction in terms.
Yeah, the web of regulations, controls, and special treatment that is created by the bureaucratic state is the main reason why you have something like Amazon being able to dominate as easy as it could. Because all the barriers there are to starting a business and to complying with regulations and doing all this stuff, the taking away the ability, like if you really wanted to create equality, what you would do is you would create a special tax tier to where if you make less than, you know, $100,000 a year or $50,000 a year, you don't even have to fill out any paperwork whatsoever or tell anyone or report anything to anyone. That would be like a huge boom in the for entrepreneurs, because you have all these people who are held back by the bureaucratic state, who are not able to create independent nodes in the economy. So I think that's like what UBI would do if you had in place like some rock solid protections for free markets, then injecting all this money into the lower levels would actually do a lot of good, because then local markets could take advantage of that huge cash influx. But if you don't have that and you have like a bunch of towns that are just a bunch of like box stores and there's a Pizza Hut and a Best Buy, like, okay, so give everyone in that town $500 a month and see where that money ends up with.
Right.
It's going to end up in a corporate bank account and probably be offshore and sitting in the Bahamas, and no one's ever going to see that money again.
Well, I want to go back to the transcendent ideal that needs to be outside of politics.
Yeah.
JP, Muslim guy. And I'm spacing out.
I guess I was sort of positing maybe like psychedelics as being the most likely candidate for that kind of newly articulated mystical core in the modern world.
It's gonna get more individuals in touch with the mystical landscape, and get more feet on the ground trying to solve the problems, answer the questions, just come up with better questions. If there's to enunciate the necessary transcendent ideal in terms of like first principles, so that the spinning out uncontrollable like logical results of that are like net good. I still think it's a lot like the Christian Bible of seeing every single person as a child of God. Every single person has a spark of the transcendent inside them, and that translates politically to inviolable human rights of the individual, and the individual's rights upheld more than the group's. I think that's one of the transcendent ideals that needs to be re-articulated and re-stressed, is if you are alive, there's a spark of God inside you.
Like the idea, like the purpose of the government is to protect the rights of the minority.
And the minority is the individual.
Yes, the ultimate minority is the individual.
Quote, Ayn Rand.
Well, it's a pretty good point. I feel like that's a pretty obvious fucking point if you really think about it.
Well, it's just, it's obvious, but it puts responsibility on your shoulders. So that's how you get collectivism. You don't have to deal with the fact of, like, being a child of God means, like, you have the responsibility to do good in the world. And, that's a challenge. Life is meant to be challenging, but if you pay people to skirt their challenges, then if you incentivize that, then you create a welfare class, and you create people who are dependent on keeping collectivism going and getting away from a stress on the individual.
What is God really doing? Isn't God creating the world?
God is alive primarily as an idea, and so it's many faces of God that change from person to person, change from year to year. But inside of that idea of God is also the trait of being independent from our projections about it. Even without Earth, God would exist. Even without humans, God would exist.
In this conversation with this Islamic scholar guy, they were talking about the ancient Mesopotamians and how...
As JP does.
Yeah, and the king, I guess apparently the kings, the god kings or whatever in that society were...
The God King.
Yeah, they had like pharaoh-like power,
Yeah.
where they were pretty much absolute rulers. However, like once a year or something, there was this ritual, and so these kings, they stayed in their palace, but once a year they would come out. They would do this ritual where the king would come outside the gates of the city, and he would walk up to the high priest of the Mesopotamian religion, and the priest would humble the king. The king would have to kneel down, and the priest would slap the king, or something like that with a glove. And I was like, that's weird. They had gloves back then. I didn't really realize that, but let's say whatever. In some way, they humbled the king, and of course, the significance of that is just asserting the primacy of the gods over the king, and reminding people and reminding the king. Oh, and also the king had to say all the bad things he did or something like that.
Yeah.
He had to make himself penitent. And so it was it's this cultural ritual to symbolize the fact that, okay, the real power is not in the city, in the palace, it's outside. It's there. Let's just be clear on who's really the source. And that's a idea. And that shows you how that culture had caught on to the idea of how having this priest class manage the ultimately powerful thing was a little bit safer than having it be completely wedded to the state. Because if the state fucks up, then now you've lost everything. But it's the idea of taking your transcendental object and putting it in a little bit different basket for safekeeping.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You got some just checks and balances going on there.
It was a metaphysical check and balance type situation. Whereas if you have something like fascism or communism, well, the government is telling you that common prosperity is the most important thing. The worker is the most important thing. Or your ethnicity is the most important thing. Whatever that is, that is in the same boat as the political enterprise.
Yeah.
And if that starts sinking, then there's going to be a mad scramble for meaning, which is extremely dangerous. So I'm just wondering, in the modern world, what the fuck what place are we going to stash our transcendent image now that we can no longer stash it in the church? Where are we going to put this material?
Well, and then psychedelics enters in the rotting body of the church sprouts the mushrooms of the sacrament. The church no longer has a monopoly on the sacrament, and suddenly it's a democratized mushroom or chemical in the form of LSD that everyone has access to. And so, like, that last spate of mystical understanding that crystallized into dogmatic religions is now back decomposing, and so now it's starting a new cycle of everyone having a bunch more mystical experiences, and the market of ideas will decide who has the best mystical experience, or like the 100 people who have the 100 best mystical experiences then gets mashed into one, like Uberman.
I just really wonder, like, concretely, does that predict the emergence of a new kind of like postmodern priest? And I mean postmodern strictly in the chronological sense, not like postmodernism, but let's say near future, like, does that predict the emergence of like a priest class? Like, I'm imagining someone who has the kind of cultural authority to slap a politician, regardless of whether or not, like, you know, like how, like, oh, we have Putin, Trump. Okay, well, I guess he's not president anymore, but I just forget that Joe Biden is president. Whatever. We have Biden, we have Putin, we have Merkel, we have whatever the fuck, the Winnie the Pooh guy. We have these people, and they're all, you know, they're politicians.
They aren't answerable to anybody.
Who's the Pope? Because the Pope is, you know, he's a politician now. But who's like the person who's like, okay, is it like someone like
the untouchable person,
yeah,
the person who can't be canceled, the person who has this unassailable bank account of fuck you money?
This unassailable kind of mystical authority, in a sense. Like, is it someone like Paul Stamets?
That has like social capital,
someone
like way more social capital.
Someone who like is a luminary figure that can sort of represent or be the figurehead of this, like a mystical understanding or something like that. Like, what is the ground, what is the context that can resist, that can serve as like the bastion of humanity that cannot be politicized?
Right, yeah. I remember the last time we touched on this, we brought up Alex and Allison Gray, and their church that they're building as one example, because it's very inclusive and non-denominational and based on the individual psychedelic experience more than anything else, and based on the ability of the individual to create art. So you have a set of ideas getting workshopped over there. I remember also when I was having my spiritual enlightenment hippie phase of life, I like went to a lot of workshops and talks and lectures and like events to like produce a mystical experience with a group of people under a leader who was like giving you the drugs or holding the ceremony or showing you how to do the breath work. If it was a holotropic breath work event, someone leading it. And so I studied under a good handful of different people. And the one lady that rung true of something to like hold on to, Sonia Sophia, she seemed legit because she didn't need your participation to continue infinitely for her like message to thrive. Like her scale of success of successfully transmitting mystical understanding to you was if you no longer needed to go to her workshops anymore and became your own node of mystical understanding that no longer needed to like pay her to do workshops with her. Like the goal was to set you on your own feet, not to create dependence. And she was unique in that. And she was also unique in being very open source in her attitude of the deepest things she'd learned from this group of monks or that spiritual teacher. And whenever one teacher or another would tell her that this was like secret and sacred and must only ever be shared behind closed doors, she would always rebel against that and go, no, if it's real, then it needs to be given free of charge to everyone who will listen.
Yeah, I appreciate that perspective.
The open source ethos was one trait of Sonia Sophia that let me know that she was a legitimate member of the priest caste of a new understanding that focuses on the individual's ability to take ownership of their experience. And the individual as the gateway to the mystical landscape. No middleman necessary.
Yeah. Like the kind of individuals that are capable of coming together and creating something larger than themselves without losing themselves.
In a way that bolsters their individuality.
Yeah, like a gathering of people who could come together and sit in a park, for example, and talk about life. And like, if anyone brought up some kind of like obvious, like topic that was just meant to sort of like position themselves in some kind of political or social hierarchy, that people would just kind of gently dismiss that person and be like, look, man, this isn't really the place for that. You just don't get it. Like, you're not...
Power over people must be clearly understood as not real power.
Yeah. Like a kind of just people that are just like, kind of understand that there's something a lot more interesting happening than whatever games we're all people are trying to... The media is trying to convince you is the most important game of life, which is your political identity or whatever it is, or your racial identity or your gender identity or whatever sort of like identities are being billed as the substitute for the transcendent identity that we lost recently. Because ultimately, I feel like when those various political, gender, racial identities, when they become used as the de facto tokens of political competition, it just degrades them.
It does.
It makes them transactional and they suck, and actually you destroy the ability for a person to truly express that aspect of their identity, because there is something there about your political, racial, gender, sexual identity. It's not bad. There is something there.
Yeah,
it's beautiful, but when it becomes a political token, it becomes terrible. And it would be nice if we could play this political game with a little more of a mystical overtone so that we didn't have to play it in this base material of politics. Maybe.
Yeah. Well, hidden in this entire conversation that you brought up and bring up is the invitation on your part, Stuart, to develop a spiritual practice and start praying regularly in whatever way that would mean to you.
Well, I feel like I already do. I space out a lot, and it feels very mystical to me.
But prayer would be directionizing the space out towards the highest ideal you can think of that moment.
Yeah.
And talking to it as such and listening to what your imagination puts in its mouth.
Like kind of like ritualizing or concretizing this process a little bit.
Like having a little altar that has the little like face that you understand is like, when I'm looking at this face, like if you're Christian, you have a icon, IKON, of Jesus, and you look at it, and that's how you psychologically know that you're in prayer. Of all the different space outs you could be happening, this space out happens on Sunday, and I turn my phone on silent, and I look in this direction, or I go into this place of the park and I look up at the trees, and something about the uplift of your head psychologically tells you that you're spacing out in the prayer direction.
A couple nights ago, I lit a candle and was staring at myself in a mirror for like 20 minutes, and it was pretty cool.
The gateway to a mystical experience. Right there.
And I don't really know why I did that.
Were you stoned?
No, I actually haven't. I've been like really tripping on like being sober. I haven't really been smoking weed at all. I've just been like, I don't know. I've just felt like naturally high a lot lately.
I understand what you mean.
Yeah. Almost like I feel really, really in my body a lot. And I just am enjoying it. I'm enjoying it, like having a little more, because right now I think just the phase of my work that I'm in is I'm trying to consolidate, and I'm trying to make things cleaner and more organized and more like put together. I'm like in the like washing my face and brushing my hair stage of this project instead of the like, you know, it's kind of like this, my ego is so attached to this that I almost like sort of like live out the moods that I'm in, where I don't feel like I'm in the, you know, need to get like stoned and walk around the woods and think of ideas mode. I'm not like that. I'm not in that mode at all right now. Is that I have way too many fucking ideas, and what I'm doing is I'm consolidating and concretizing them. And that is where the sober mind is an incredibly powerful tool.
Yeah, the mind, or the present moment, and being physical in the center of it is the primary psychedelic input. And I think
It's pretty psychedelic.
And my intuition that's been building by very slow but steady iterations for a lot of years is a growing rapport with the physical experience and its ability to spontaneously become a gateway to the mystical experience. Your body triggering a mystical experience just in its like being physically built to do that itself, independent of any plant or chemical. I had this day when I was like sleeping, taking a nap, and I started a mantra in my head, or I just started repeating in my head over and over again, I am asleep, or I'm falling asleep, I'm falling asleep, I'm falling asleep. I said that out loud in my head while I was lying down, and then I was suddenly hearing it reverberating through this huge space instead of saying it. And I was like, whoa, well, like, where am I then if I'm not the person saying that? Someone else, that's now just happening of itself, and I'm hearing it boom through a cavernous space. What's the cavernous space I'm in? And I was like in a ancient underground temple space inside my body, like the size of an atom. That was how huge the inner space of my body was. And I am asleep, I am asleep was like booming through the air. And the space was like filled with these huge stones of rock that were like reforming themselves into different shaped rooms and stuff. And,
I'm thinking of Waterworks from Halo 2.
Yeah, ancient like forerunners architecture. But the temple was intelligent and responding to my changing conscious mind experience. And that was just...
That's fucking sick. That sounds like a dream.
That was just lying down in my bed with a
And you weren't even
mantra.
asleep. You were just like in
Yeah,
this somewhat...
I was very awake in
Wow.
that experience. So that opened up a line of questioning since that happened of like, what
the hell?
is a body then?
Oh, yeah.
What is a body and what is its heritage? Like going to like conspiracy theory, ancient aliens type thing. Like, what is this body?
Graham Hancock.
Where did this body come from? Where is it going?
Your body's a piece of technology.
Yes.
The question is, what is it for, ultimately? What's its purpose? That's what it is. Because, like, you might look at the way that we're just continuing, we're like, whatever, surviving and reproducing. Okay, but why are we doing that? Is there some kind of larger level dynamic of what's going on with the Earth? Is there some kind of, like, ecological stage on which planets are...
The body as a computer, the Earth as a computer, the solar system as a computer, the galaxy as a computer. Yeah,
what are the stages and what are the time scales, and where is consciousness in this system other than us, if anywhere?
I think it's gonna be us in the future, interstellar style, where we go so far that we become independent of time, and then we look back at time as a physical object, and we then see the story that it's trying to make, and we just add the punctuation mark at the end of it, and that punctuation mark on the part of super human beings of the far future is the Big Bang at the beginning.
Roger Penrose. Yes.